Alexa, play Taylor Swift on Spotify. Thanks for the shares. Good morning, everyone. I'm just working on getting this memorial quilt quilted. Thank you so much for all the likes. I just finished doing all of my lines in this direction, so I'm turning my quilt to the side so I can start going in the opposite direction. And I'm going to drop my needle into my quilt and bring it back up so that my bobbin thread comes to the top. This prevents any knots or nests of threads on the back of the quilt. And I'm just stitching in the ditch on this quilt. So that means I'm lining up my quilting with the seams of the patchwork. I'm doing this because all of these fabrics are from somebody's shirts, and I want those to be the focal part of the quilt, not the quilting on top. morning, everyone. Just working on getting this memorial quilt quilted. Morning, Beverly. Thank you for the likes. At the end of my line of stitching, I'm just putting a little knot, cutting my threads, and going back up to the top. Again, I'm going to drop my needle into my quilt, bring it back up so that my bobbin thread comes to the top of the quilt. I can never grab it. There we go. That prevents any knots or nests from forming on the back of the quilt. And I have my sewing machine set to make a tiny knot when I start a line of stitching. I'm using a special foot on my machine that has a tiny ledge right there that I can line up with my seam lines to try to keep my quilting exactly where I want it to go. Beverly, I'm using an Elna Expressive 900. They don't make it anymore, but I think the 920 is very similar. Jolene, thanks so much for watching. Design 78, thanks for following. And I do have videos of how I put this quilt together. These fabrics are all shirts from somebody who passed away. When I make a memorial quilt, I spend time talking to the person who's ordering it. And together we come up with a design. Then I draft my patterns myself. And again, I did make videos of how this whole quilt is pieced. So if you want to see how this top came together, go check those out. And now I'm just getting this quilted and then bound, and then it'll be mailed off to the family. Thank you for all the likes. I really appreciate them. For anyone just joining, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. So all these plaid fabrics in this quilt came from shirts of somebody who passed away. This quilt was ordered by his daughter, and it's going to be a gift for his wife. Texas Fireball, thanks for following. I'm doing stitch in the ditch quilting, and I'm doing that on this quilt because I want these fabrics to really be the focal point, and I don't want any quilting to take away from that. So I'm lining my stitch lines up with the seams in the quilt. Wow, I'm up to 1,000 likes already. Thank you so much. I have about 12 to 14 hours of work already into this quilt. And that doesn't include design time or the time spent shopping for the background fabric. Oh, sorry. And this border. Julian, this quilt is 60 by 80. Which is the size that the client asked for. Which is a nice big throw quilt. Oh, I really hope she loves it. She's gotten a few sneak peeks, and so far she's been very happy. Thank you so much for all the likes. For all the people who just joined, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. I'm doing stitch in the ditch, which means I'm keeping my quilting lines lined up with the seam lines of the quilt. That way the quilting kind of disappears and the fabrics really stay the main focal point of this quilt. All the plaid quilts in the quilt are a man's shirts. His daughter sent them to me so I could make a quilt for his wife. Allison, thank you so much for following. At the beginning of every line of stitching, I drop my presser foot, which is this part of the machine here. Then I lower my needle and bring it back up, and that pulls the bobbin thread up from the bottom, and that prevents any nests or knots from forming on the back of the quilt. Then I have my sewing machine set to create a tiny invisible knot at the beginning and end of each line of stitching. I'm also using a special presser foot called a stitch in the ditch foot, and it has a tiny ledge on the bottom of it. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, right there. And that lines up with the line of stitching so that I can keep my quilting lines exactly where I want them to be. I already did all the lines going in this direction, and now I'm working on all the ones going in this direction. Well, Elizabeth, this is your sign to start up again. Good morning, Mom. I'm just checking my bobbin thread in here to make sure I'm not going to run out on the next line of stitching, which it looks like I'm good for a while. Jolene, I do teddy bears too. If you want to see pictures of them, you can check out my Instagram or my Facebook, which is Steel Makes on everything. For anyone just joining, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. All of the plaid fabrics in this quilt are her father's shirts. And she ordered this as a gift for her mom. For the quilting, I'm doing straight line quilting in the ditch. So that means I'm keeping my quilting lines lined up with the seams of the quilt top. And I chose this because it really lets the fabrics be the focal point of the quilt. When I first started sewing when I was a teenager, I borrowed my grandma's old Sears Kenmore. Thank you, Elizabeth. And when I'm all done, I'll go back and trim off all of these little tails of thread. At the beginning of each line of stitching, I lower my presser foot, drop my needle down into the quilt, and then raise it back up, and that pulls the bobbin thread up to the top of the fabric. And that prevents you from getting any visible knots or nests on the back of your quilt. Then I have my sewing machine set to put a small invisible knot at the beginning and end of each line of stitching. Then I'm just going to keep this line of stitching lined up as best I can with the seam in my quilt top. User 7720, thanks for following. Honey Touch, a 50-inch square is a great size to start quilting on. You want to start in the very center of your quilt and work out. Camille, thanks for following. Then the part of the quilt that's to the right of the needle, you want to keep either rolled up or bunched up over here so it's out of the way. Also, if you can, put your sewing machine on the biggest table that you have available and try to keep the table clear all the way around it. So that way you have the weight of the quilt supported while you're trying to move it through your machine. If you have a walking foot and you're doing straight line quilting, definitely use the walking foot because that'll help also with the weight going through the machine. If you're going to do free motion quilting, then get some free motion quilting gloves, which will help grip the top of the quilt. Someone just joining, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. I started quilting in the very center, and now I am out to the edge of where my patchwork is. Thanks, Camille. I just got them done this weekend. So now I'm going to flip my quilt around and work in the other direction. I'm going to look at the back to try to figure out where I was. This is the next line. Thanks for the tiny diny, Honey Touch. Okay. So now that I have my quilt where I want it to be, I'm going to lower my presser foot and my needle just to hold it in place so I can get all of the quilt that's over to the right of the needle up under my machine. And then, sorry, I'll adjust the camera again. It got bumped when I was moving the quilt. Now the weight of the quilt is either resting to the left of my machine on my table or on my lap. You don't want it pulling down on you or on the quilt, because then your sewing machine won't be able to move the weight of the quilt. I need to grab my hemostat so I can grab that thread easier. Mel, thanks for the follow. Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Drew it cutout pieces. LL White, thanks for following. Oh, Elizabeth, this is a pattern I made up. I didn't follow any pattern. Jen Cat, thanks for following. Jenny Cat, I'm quilting the quilt. So this is the top of the quilt that I pieced together. All of these flannels, excuse me, are shirts from somebody who passed away. His daughter ordered this quilt for me as a gift for his wife. So I pieced this whole quilt top, and then I layered it with a piece of backing fabric, which is this blue here, and a piece of batting, which is the middle part of the quilt that makes it nice and warm. And now I'm quilting all three of those layers together. At the top of each line, I drop the foot of the machine, the presser foot here. Then I dropped my needle down into the fabric and pulled it back up so I can pull the bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt. That prevents you from getting any visible knots or nesting on the back of the quilt. Then I have my sewing machine set to make a tiny invisible knot at the beginning and end of each line of stitching. Amanda, on every machine, it's different. Mine, here, let me. Mine has a stitch right here. Can you see that? That has the knot at the beginning and end of every line of stitching. Or there's also a function right here that will make the knot. I had to figure out how I had this. You're having a hard time getting your pieces lined up. Now, the first step is to make sure that your cutting is accurate. So to do that, you have to iron your fabric. If you start your fabric, that can help prevent it from stretching out of place. And then when you work on sewing your pieces together, you really have to make sure that your 1/4 inch seam allowance is right on every time. So practice a lot, measure your pieces before and after you sew them together to make sure that your 1/4 inch is really perfect. Then after you sew each piece, it's back to the ironing board to press your seams nice and flat, to make sure that they are opened completely and you don't have any folds that are going to make them the wrong size. Again, you're pressing, you're not ironing. So with your iron, you just want to do an up and down motion on your fabric, not a pressing back and forth, because that's going to distort your fabric. And then it'll be a different size and won't fit together. of course, all of that just comes with practice. Thank you so much for all the likes. I really appreciate it. For anyone who just joined, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt. All of these flannel squares are pieces of shirts from a gentleman who passed away in Georgia. His daughter sent me all of his shirts to turn into a quilt that she's going to gift to her mother. So my machine just did a little knot here, and I'm going to move back to the top and start on the next line. Oh, sorry. So every line of stitching I do, I'm going to grab a hold of my top thread that comes from the top of the machine through my needle. I'm going to drop my presser foot, which is this piece here, and then I'm going to lower my needle down into my fabric and bring it back up out of the fabric. That pulls the bobbin thread, which is the machine that comes up, the thread that comes up. Sorry. That pulls the bobbin thread, which is the thread that comes up from the bottom of the machine up to the top. And doing this prevents you from having any visible knots or nests on the back of your fabric. Then I have my sewing machine set to make a little tiny knot at the beginning of each line of stitching. I'm doing stitch in the ditch on this quilt, which means I'm lining my quilting lines up with the seams of the quilt top. Yeah, you have to have a lot of patience to quilt. It's a dedication of time, that's for sure. The reason I'm doing stitch in the ditch is because I want all of these beautiful shirts to be the focal point of the quilt. I don't want the quilting to take away. And I'm using a special foot on my sewing machine called a stitch in the ditch foot. And it has a tiny shelf on the bottom of it. I don't know if you can see that from your angle, but I'm using that to line up on all of my seams to try to keep my quilting exactly where I want it to be. Oh, a 2-inch hexagon. Did you hand stitch all of your hexagons? Black Diamond Quilting, thank you so much for following. If you hand pieced your hexagons, then I would go with a more traditional style quilting. So for hexagons, that would be either straight lines that line up with each edge. Oh, I'm sorry. If you hand pieced all of your hexagons, then I would do with a traditional style quilting for that kind of quilt. So for that, it would be to do straight lines that line up with all of the sides of your hexagon. And you don't have to do each hexagon individually. You can do straight lines all the way across on either side of each seam. So like a 1/4 inch away of each seam. If you want to do free motion quilting, then the most traditionally used kind of quilting would be a meander. And you would want to do a tighter meander. So that's kind of just, like the swirls around the quilt. And they used to do them really tight together. I have 2 hexagon quilts that I started this year. They'll probably take me 5 years to finish. But After doing all of that handwork piecing it, I'm definitely going to hand quilt those quilts. Catherine, thanks for following. For anyone who is joining, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client from Georgia. Her dad passed away and she mailed me all of his plaid shirts. And I created this quilt that she's going to gift to her mom. Stitches and Sews, thanks for following. User, thanks for following. I'm stitching in the ditch, which means I'm keeping my stitching lines lined up with the seams of the quilt top. Thank you so much for all the likes. Yeah, I love memorial quilts. When my dad passed away, I made 6 quilts out of all of his clothing. And I use mine almost every day. I've never done a bow tie quilt. Yeah, that was six quilts was a lot. And they were all the same design, which got pretty exhausting after a while, but it was a very therapeutic process to do. Moonfire, thanks for following. So now all of his grandkids have quilts. I have a quilt. My mom has a quilt. And I gifted them to everyone on Christmas, and it was a surprise. It was nice. I put little labels on them that said a love for dad, a hug from dad. Stitches and Sews, I use Pellon 911 FF interfacing. It's a iron-on interfacing that is very, very lightweight. So that prevents any of these stretchy fabrics from stretching out of shape. And I do that on all of the clothing. That's Pellon 911 FF. At the top of each line of stitching, I lowered my presser foot, dropped my needle down into the quilt, and then raised my needle back up so I could pull the bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt. That prevents you from getting any visible knots or nests on the back of your fabric. Sounds a little different. Then I have my sewing machine set to make a tiny invisible knot at the beginning of each line of stitching. You can also just pull, oh, I'm out of bobbin thread. You can also just pull the ends of your thread up without knotting and then knot them by hand and use a needle to bury them into the quilt when you're all done. But of course that takes a lot of extra time. Kelly, thanks for following. My bobbin just ran out of thread, but luckily I have another one already ready to go. I don't think that went in there right. Oh, it did. My top thread is in the way. Sweetwater, thank you for following. Paige, thank you so much for following. Thank you everybody for all the likes. I really appreciate it. People must just be waking up because we're getting a lot more people watching. Okay, so all of these threads, when I'm all done, will be able to be trimmed away. Again, I'm starting a line of stitching, so I'm going to drop my presser foot down, drop my needle down into the machine, and raise it back up. And that pulls that bobbin thread up to the top of the machine. I do that to prevent any visible knots or nests from forming on the back of the quilt. They're just not pretty. Then I'm going to start my line of stitching. Sabrina, thanks for following. And I have my machine set to make a tiny knot at the beginning and end of each line of stitching. This is a memorial quilt, so all of these flannels were sent to me by a woman in Georgia whose dad passed away. She ordered this quilt as a gift for her mom. All of my memorial quilts, I spend time talking to the families and we come up with a design together. Then I draft the patterns myself before making the quilts, so they're getting exactly what they're looking for. For this stitching, I'm using a technique called stitch in the ditch, which means I'm keeping my quilting lined up with the seams in the quilt. I'm doing this because I really want all these fabrics to be the main focal point of the quilt. I don't want any quilting to take away from them. Sometimes it can be difficult to keep your line of stitching lined up. So I'm using a specialty foot on my machine. This is called a stitch in the ditch foot, and it has a little ledge right there. I don't know if you can see it, that lines up with the line of stitching. So I can keep my quilting as close to where I want it to be as possible. $5K for a Janome. A Janome is one of the best sewing machines you can get as a home sewer. It's gonna last you forever. $5K is a little steep, especially if you are brand new to sewing. In my opinion, maybe that's within your budget, which is fine. My first sewing machine was about $500, and it lasted me a good 10 years until I decided that I wanted to make larger quilts and quilt them myself on my machine. This current machine that I am using is an Elna, which is the sister brand to Janome, so they're both made by the same people. It has a lot of the same features as a Janome, but at a lot lower price. I actually got it used on Facebook Marketplace for just over $1,000, and it was in absolutely perfect, pristine condition. She even had the boxes that it came in. But if my opinion on a Janome is it's a fantastic machine and it'll last you your whole life. I have 3 sewing machines. I have my first machine, which was called a Lena. It was about $500. It is not computerized. It's more of a bare bones machine. My dad actually bought it for me when I was a teenager. And that I made tons of quilts on that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a fantastic machine. Then during the pandemic, when I was making hundreds and hundreds, thousands of face masks, it broke. And it was really hard to get your sewing machines fixed. Everywhere was backed up weeks and weeks, and it was really hard to get parts. So I went out to Walmart and I bought a Singer sewing machine for about $300. It had a thread cutter, which it was the first machine that I used that had a thread cutter, and that seemed like such a luxury when I was making so many masks. That it's a great machine. It's a workhorse. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, and it is pretty small, meaning the space between the arm of the machine, which is over that way, and the needle is pretty narrow. Regina and Dino Girl, thank you so much for following. So that machine got me through thousands of face masks, and that's the one that I use when I go on like a retreat or sewing day with my quilt guild or anything like that, because it is really lightweight and it works really well. So then I started making more quilts and they got bigger and bigger, so I needed a slightly larger machine to quilt them on. I do quilt all of my quilts myself, except I do have a king size quilt that I just do not want to baste, so I'm going to send that one to a friend who has a long arm so she can quilt that for me. But I do quilt all of my quilts myself, so a larger machine was definitely necessary. I was looking at a Jazz 2, which is a machine that only does straight stitching, but it has a 10-inch throat space, which is really big. But then I found on Facebook Marketplace a woman who was selling this machine. This is an Elna Expressive 900, which they don't make anymore. The new model is the 920. I think it's pretty similar, but it has an 11-inch throat space. Again, that's the space between the needle and the arm of the machine. And it also does embroidery, which is something I was interested in, so I can make quilt labels and sweatshirts and all that kind of stuff. When I went to look at the machine, it was in brand new condition. It didn't look like she used it at all. It was perfectly clean, not a speck of lint in sight, and she had all of the original boxes for it. So I did buy this for about $1,200. I love it. I'm very happy with this purchase. I would love to get an antique singer. I'd love to get a featherweight, but that's just not in the budget right now. Thank you for the follow, and thank you so much for all of the likes. I really appreciate it. For anybody who's just joining, I am working on quilting a memorial quilt. This is for a client who lives in Georgia. Her dad passed away, so she sent me all of his plaid shirts. We worked together for a while to pick the pattern we were going to use. I draft the patterns myself for memorial quilts. And then she's going to use this as a gift for her mom. Nicole, thanks for following. Thank you, Lori, for following. Thank you, Moonshine, for following. So at the beginning of every line of stitching, I'm going to lower my presser foot. Then I'm going to hold my top thread. This is the thread that comes from the top of the machine and through the needle. Then I'm going to lower my needle down into the machine and bring my needle back up. And that pulls the bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt. I do this to prevent any visible knots or nests to form on the back of my quilt. A nest is just like a bundle of threads that's not very pretty to look at. Colleen, thanks for following. Then I have my machine set to create a tiny knot at the beginning of every line of stitching. And for this quilt, I'm doing stitch in the ditch. So I'm lining my line of quilting up with the seams in the quilt. That way I'm not taking away from these shirts at all. I'm just accenting them with the stitching. Thank you so much for all the follows and all of the likes. I really appreciate it. I do have videos showing the process of piecing this quilt, so how I'm preparing the fabric and putting it together. How do I mount my camera? I have an arm that I got on Amazon, and it is mounted to the right side of my desk, and it just comes up and over. It's kind of right above my left hand, and it sits a good 6 inches above the quilt. You have 4 memorial quilts to make. Top's done, just starting on the quilting. Yeah, 4 is a lot to quilt. Are they very big? When my dad passed away, I did 6 in about a year and a half. So if you're gonna the question was if it's easier to use this foot to stitch in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch is not as easy as people make it out to be. A lot of people say that it's the easiest way to quilt your quilt, but it can be really difficult to keep your line of stitching lined up with the seam. I do a lot of times use a 1/4 inch away from the seams instead of stitch in the ditch, because then you don't have to line it up as perfectly and it looks intentional instead of just accidentally you not being able to line it up. This presser foot is a specialty foot. It is a stitch in the ditch foot, And it has, I don't know if you can see this on the camera, a little ledge of metal right here that you can line up with the seams in your quilt to try to keep your stitching exactly where you want it to be. I don't think that I would be able to line this up as well as I did. There's a little thread there. Without this foot. As you can see, you can barely see. There's a line of stitching here, there's a line of stitching here, a line of stitching here. Thank you so much for all the follows. 5,000 likes, thank you. That's amazing. I'll keep an eye on the time because I do have to work at 8, but hopefully I can get this done, this entire quilt quilted, before I have to get to work today. Okay, so I've quilted all of my lines across the quilt this way. Then I turned my whole quilt around and I just finished quilting all of my lines this way. Yeah, Sweetwater, I would love to get a long arm, but that is just not in the budget. Hi, Jenny. Thank you for following. Here's what those lines of stitching look like on the back of the quilt. I used a complementary thread that really blends in. Now I'm going to go all the way around my border. I think I'm going to change my top thread to white just in case if I do go on either side of that seam, you won't see it at all. Thank you so much for all the follows. So let me move this. I hope I'm not making anyone sick. Here's the top of my machine. I like to use Orthil thread. Tegan, thank you so much. The #1 gifter badge. Austin, thank you for following. Okay, so here is a spool of white. Let me see if I can find the end. Thank you for all the follows. So I'm going to go ahead and thread my machine. Every machine threads a little bit differently, but it's all the same basic. There are tensioning discs inside of the machine that you have to make sure to get your thread into. And that's what keeps the nice even tension between the top thread and the bottom thread, which I don't think I got in there. There we go. This machine has a threader in it. I'll just bring that down. Thanks for all the follows. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch on either side of my border. So just pick anywhere to start. I'm going to lower my presser foot. Oh, that is out of focus. Is that better? Okay, so lower my presser foot, drop my needle down into the machine, and then bring it back up. And that pulls the bobbin thread to the top of the machine. That prevents any visible knots or nests from forming on the back of the quilt. I am using 2 different colors. Thank you, Jenny. Which is perfectly fine to do as long as your tension on your machine is set correctly and you won't see them from the other side. My machine is set to make a tiny knot at the beginning of my line of stitching. And then I'm just going to follow along the seams of my quilt. When I get to the point where I want to turn, I'm going to leave my needle down. Then I'm going to raise my presser foot and turn the entire quilt. Jen Cat, the tension really just depends on your machine and what kind of thread you're using. There's no one set tension to use that's going to work across every machine and across every project. So now that I've turned my quilt, I'll put my presser foot back down and start stitching down this line. Humbled Elaine, Angie, thank you so much for following. For anyone who's just joining, I am working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. It's for a woman in Georgia whose dad passed away, so she sent me all of these plaid shirts that I turned into a quilt, and she's going to gift to her mother. Jen Cat, you definitely want to use a good quality thread. You don't want to use one that's been sitting on the spool for years and years and years, because it can dry rot and break easily. But if you're having issue with a new thread breaking a lot, you might want to change your needle and rethread your machine. I do sell quilts. I have my email and my link in my bio if you want to order a custom quilt or a memorial quilt. I do have a couple quilts that I've already made listed on my Etsy. I have about 4 that are going to be listed soon. So keep an eye out for those. And all the links are in my bio. Yes, I use spray basting to baste my 3 layers together. I think it holds together the best. And it's the quickest. It's much quicker than pinning for me. I like to use 505 spray. It's my favorite brand. But June Taylor spray is pretty good too if you can't get the 505. They have 505 at Joann's, and they have the June Taylor at Walmart. Good morning. I do sell t-shirt quilts. My email is in my bio. It's steelmakes@gmail.com. So if you want to send me an email, I can get you a quote. Oh, I'm so sorry. Nicole, pricing is really hard to do, especially as a maker. It's hard to value yourself as much as you deserve. A lot goes into it though. Your level of experience, you have to know how long it's going to take you to make, how much your materials are going to cost. Because even though I'm using, someone's shirts to make a lot of this quilt, all of this white background fabric I had to buy, all of this border, the batting, the backing, the thread, the basting spray, trips to the quilting store, all that stuff adds up. So I have an hourly rate that I like to make, and I know roughly based on the design that the person is looking for, how many hours it's going to take me and how much the fabric is going to cost. So I just multiply my hourly rate by the hours and add on my materials. Samwise, thank you so much. Thank you for all the follows and all the likes. I really appreciate it. I do have videos on how I put this quilt top together and my process for preparing the material. There are special steps that you have to take when you're working with clothing versus regular quilting cotton to make sure nothing stretches out of place. Yes, Sam, you definitely should make one. So if you want to find my site on Etsy, it's Steele, Steele, Makes, Makes. Or I do have the link in my bio as well. Good morning. Congratulations on finishing your quilt last night. That's great. Sweetwater, it's really random where I go live. I'm trying to do it more often. I do a lot of quilting right before I go to work. So that's like this time of day. I have about another 20-25 minutes before I have to get over to my desk. I work from home, so I can work on this right before. Every once in a while, I do lives in the evening too. Good morning, Donna. I use an Elna Expressive 900. They don't make them anymore. I hear the 920 model is very similar. Talon, I'm going to use homemade bias strip tapes. I'm using a white and blue stripe. Stripe is my absolute favorite fabric to use on a binding. I just love the way it looks on a finished quilt. Thank you for following. Let me show you my binding for this. So that is the binding strip. For anybody who doesn't know, the binding, oh, I'm sorry, I keep bumping the camera. Too much quilt and not enough space. So the binding is the strip of fabric that goes around the outside edge of the quilt to cover up the batting and the raw edges. And stripe is my favorite to use. Good morning. Thank you so much for following. I do have a recent video of my entire process of binding a quilt. It's probably like 8 or 10 videos back at this point. So if you want to check out that process. I also have videos on the process of making this quilt top, including preparing the material, which is a little bit different when you're using clothing versus regular quilting cotton. Just because clothing stretches and you want to try to prevent that. So when you see me stop and this hand goes out of frame, I'm usually adjusting all of the weight of the quilt that's over to the left side to make sure that it's not pulling on my machine. If it's pulling on the machine, then it's going to make my stitches look really teeny tiny and close together instead of uniform, which is what I want. I do have my sewing machine on a nice large desk, and it's all the way over to the right hand side of the desk, so there's lots of room on the left for the quilt to rest. And I move as much stuff off of the quilt as possible so I have a clear space. If not, I'd be knocking everything over with the edge of the quilt. These are all the threads from when I was working on the vertical and horizontal lines, and because I had my machine knot the lines of stitching for me, I could just trim these right off. If your machine doesn't have that feature, you can either put a couple stitches in forward, backwards, and then forward again over themselves, and that will knot them into place. Or you can pull your tails up, knot them by hand, and then use a needle to bury the threads in between the layers. Of course, that takes a lot longer, and I only really do that if I'm going to be submitting the quilt to be judged at a show. Because that's something the judges will look at. So I'm coming up on a corner here. So in order to turn and start working down the other side of my quilt, I'm going to leave my needle in the down position, raise my presser foot, and then pivot the entire quilt around. Then I can start sewing down the next side. Thank you for sharing the live. That really helps me out. I really appreciate it. I get the bobbin, so I'll show you the next time I start a line of stitching how I bring the bobbin thread up. But what I do is I lower my presser foot, drop my needle down into the quilt, and then raise my needle again, and that will bring the bobbin thread up. See, on the small square, I cut my fabric to 2.5, so after it's sewn in, it's 2 inches. The large square, I cut my fabric to 4.5, so after it's sewn in, it is 4 inches. Thank you so much for the follows. If I miss any questions, just ask them again. Sometimes it scrolls too fast for me to catch, especially when I'm looking at the quilt and not my phone. Thank you for the follows and likes. Albert, this is a memory quilt. I'm all the way back at the beginning again. So this is where, if you can see, this is where I started stitching this side. So this quilt was ordered by a woman in Georgia. All of these plaid shirts are her dad's, who passed away. She ordered this as a gift for her mom. Telling, yep, after I just finished on the inside, so now I'm going to sew on the outside. Sam, I will definitely show you the whole quilt. Marcel, thank you so much for the gift. I really appreciate that. So I just told my machine to make another little knot right there, and then my machine automatically cuts my thread so I can just move on. Thank you so much. I'm doing stitch in the ditch here. So that means I'm keeping my lines of quilting in all of the seams of the quilt. I'm doing that because I really want the fabrics to be the focal point of this quilt because it is a memorial quilt. These are her dad's shirts, lots of memories attached there. So now I'm starting a new line of stitching. I want to bring the bobbin thread, which is the thread underneath the machine, up to the top of the fabric. I'm doing that because if you don't, then you'll have a very high chance of getting visible knots and visible nests, which are just big bundles of thread on the back of your quilt, and they are not very pretty. So I'm going to lower my presser foot, which is this part of the machine here. I'm using a specialty presser foot that has a little ledge of metal right here that helps me line up my stitching with the seam. It's called a stitch in the ditch foot. Albert used computerized quilting. Yeah, I wish I had a long arm so I could do that, but unfortunately that is not in the budget. So I'm going to lower my presser foot, then I'm going to lower my needle down into the fabric, and then with my presser foot still down, I'm going to bring my needle back up. Then that brought the bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt. You can see I'm using a different color on the back of my quilt as I am on the front of my quilt. So I'm going to grab both of my threads and stick them under my quilt, or under my foot. And then I have my machine set, so it's going to create a tiny knot when I start my line of stitching. So you'll see my needle go up and down a few times without the quilt moving at all. So So then I can just continue on with my line of stitching, and then those little thread tails can be trimmed off. Pumpkinhead, thanks for sharing. I really appreciate that. That helps me out a lot. If your machine does not have the feature where it will knot the fabrics for you, or sorry, knot the threads for you, you can just reverse over your stitching a couple stitches, go back and forth, and that will create the knot in the thread for you. So the distance between your lines of quilting is going to be determined by what kind of batting you use. The batting is this middle material that's in between the back and the top of the quilt. It's what makes your quilt nice and warm. There's all different battings that you can get. There's 100% cotton, which is what I typically use. There is polyester, there's bamboo, there's silk, there's blends, all different options. But on your package of batting, it will say how large the distance in between your stitching can be. If you don't follow those instructions, when you wash the quilt, you can get the batting in the middle bunched up. Just like if you've ever bought a cheap comforter and washed it and your batting bunched up in the middle. The colors in this quilt are blue, white, and green. There's a little bit of like a brown too. These are all somebody's shirts. So I didn't pick the colors. It tends, when it's all coming out of one person's wardrobe, they tend to go together really well. Make a really nice color palette. Now the batting that I use allows you to stitch up to 10 inches apart, which is really, really great. It's a really large space. So that gives me the freedom to choose my quilting based on what I want the quilting to look at and not be limited by what my batting will allow. So that means in this border, if I don't want a line of stitching, cutting it in half, I don't have to. Yeah, I've used like minky fabric, which is furry and fluffy and beautiful for backings before. They're really nice on baby quilts. They make them a little bit cushy, so if they want to use them for tummy time or something. Of course, it's really nice and warm. So this is my last little section that I need to quilt before I trim and bind this quilt. So as I'm going around, I'm going to go ahead and trim, excuse me, all of my thread tails so I don't have to go back and do that later. Thank you for sharing and following. Again, if you're new, if you just joined, I'm working on quilting a memorial quilt for a client. It's a woman in Georgia whose dad passed away, so she sent me all of his plaid shirts. We spent about a week talking back and forth so I could figure out exactly what kind of pattern she wanted and what she wanted the finished quilt to look like. Then I self-drafted this quilt pattern based on the look and the size she wanted. I have videos on how I pieced this quilt and also how I prepared the materials. And she's going to use this as a gift for her mom. So it's almost done. Hopefully I can get it out to her by the end of the week. If you're interested in getting a memorial quilt, you can send me an email, which I have in my bio. Will I live stream the binding process? I can do that tomorrow morning. I usually start sewing between 6 and 6:30 in the morning, and then I work at 8. So I have to finish up soon here. But I do have a full video. I have lots of videos on binding quilts. you go back, I think it's probably 8 to 10 videos back is the last binding video I made. And it goes through the entire process, start to finish. Oh, a tie quilt. I've always wanted to do a tie quilt. I bet it's going to be beautiful. Do you change your settings on your iron for that? I always worry about like melting a tie. Thank you for all the follows. I'm going to finish up this last line of stitching and then I'll show you what this quilt looks like. I'll hang it up so you can see the whole thing. And then I'll be signing off for the day. Well, for the morning. So if you haven't followed, go ahead and do that now so I don't get lost in the cosmos. Ooh, a tie tree skirt. Oh, I bet that's gorgeous and so special every year when you pull it out. I'm getting to the corner of where I want my line of stitching to be. So in order to make this turn really nice and 90 degree, I'm going to go all the way up to the edge. I'm going to leave my needle down in the machine, raise my presser foot, and then turn my quilt. So my needle is holding it in place. Then I can just drop my presser foot and keep on stitching. Thank you for the likes. Ooh, flooding with hearts. I love it. Thank you. A 1967 Singer. Yeah, those Singers, those vintage Singers are workhorses. I would love to get a featherweight. Jem, thank you so much for the gifts. Bill, this is 60 inches by 80 inches. Telling I'm on Eastern time. So it is 7:46 a.m. here. Jen, make sure you check out my videos because I have tons of step-by-step tutorials on how I make quilts, including how I made this quilt and how I prepped the fabric for this memorial quilt. Working with clothing is a little bit different than working with regular quilting cotton. Helen, I like a 3.0 stitch length on quilting. I use a 2.0 when I'm piecing. Jem, yeah, this quilt is made out of clothing. So I do cut all the fabric myself. I also designed all these patterns myself. Okay, so so I'm almost done here. Just a couple more inches. And then I'm going to tell my sewing machine to create another knot to secure the stitching in place. You can see the needle just goes up and down in the same spot a few times. Yes, Nicole, Eastern Standard. Okay, and give me 1 second. I'll hang this up so you can get a look at it. Thanks, Jessie. Oh, it's too heavy. It just fell down. Give me 1 second. Okay. If anybody gets motion sick, look away for a second. I'm going to move the camera so you can see what this quilt looks like. And there it is. So again, this is a memorial quilt. All of the plaid fabrics were sent to me by a client who lives in Georgia. There are the shirts that her dad wore. Thanks, Jessie. Thank you so much, everyone. So she ordered this as a gift for her mom. We worked together to design the quilt. I designed the pattern myself. And I do have videos on how I pieced this top. Somebody asked to see my machine and my filming setup. So here is my desk. Here's my filming arm. And then this is my machine. It's an Elna Expressive 900. I got it used on Facebook Marketplace for a great price. Grits, I used 13 different shirts. Could definitely do it with a lot less. Probably do it with 4 or 5. But she really wanted this scrappy look. And of course, the more shirts you use, the more memories you can point out. Memorial quilts are fantastic because you can cuddle underneath them and you can say, oh, remember, Dad wore this shirt when we went here, or he wore this when we did that. And if you want to see the back of the quilt, Rita, thank you so much. There's what all that quilting stitching looks like on the back. There are a couple threads that need to be cleaned up. So then this quilt just needs to be trimmed. So all this excess batting and backing fabric will be trimmed off. And then I'll put my binding strips on. If you didn't see the binding, that's the fabric that goes around the edge that covers all the raw edges. And I really like to use a stripe when I can. So that's what that looks like. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Listen, Linda. Linda, listen. Thank you so much, everyone who watched this morning. I do unfortunately have to get to work. So if you haven't followed yet, make sure you follow along. Someone asked me to do the binding on live, so we'll try to do that tomorrow morning. I'm Eastern Standard Time. I'll probably come on around 6:30. Thank you, everyone. It's not a queen sized. It's 60 inches by 80 inches. They wanted a large throw. Everyone have a great day. Thank you so much.